Commander Kate Morgan stood on the deck of the USS Valiant and watched the alien ship come down from the sky like a burning star falling to Earth, and the morning sun made the ocean sparkle like diamonds, but she could not enjoy the beauty because today would change everything for humanity, and maybe not in a good way. The Zaltharian Empire had sent word 3 weeks ago that they wanted to meet with Earth's military forces, and they said it was for friendship and cooperation, but intelligence. Reports told a different story, and these aliens had conquered 17 different star systems, and they had weapons that could destroy entire planets and turn them into glass wastelands, and now they wanted to test Earth forces to see if humans were worth keeping alive, or if they should be eliminated like all the other primitive species the Empire had encountered. Kate felt someone move beside her, and she did not need to turn to know it was Arya, because the elf moved so quietly that most people never heard her coming, and Arya had appeared on Earth 6 months ago, and she claimed to be one of the last survivors of an ancient race that once ruled the galaxy, and at first nobody believed her, but then she demonstrated abilities that no human possessed, and she could move faster than the eye could follow, and she was stronger than any human soldier, and she knew things about the universe that Earth scientists were only beginning to discover. Arya wore simple combat gear, like the rest of the SEAL team, but somehow she made it look elegant, and her silver hair was tied back in a tight braid, and her violet eyes tracked the alien ship as it settled onto the landing platform that had been constructed specifically for this meeting. And those eyes had seen centuries pass, and Kate sometimes wondered what it was like to live that long, and to watch civilizations rise and fall like waves on a beach. Elf spoke softly, and her voice had a musical quality that made even simple words sound beautiful, and she said, "The Zeltharians are arrogant. They believe they are the strongest force in the galaxy. They have forgotten that there are older things than them, and things that are far more dangerous." It asked if the elves were one of those dangerous things, and Arya smiled, but it was not a happy smile, and she said, "Once upon a time. Yes, but now we are just remnants and shadows of what we used to be, and we survive by being forgotten." A low rumble came from above, and Kate looked up to see Ember coiled around the forward mast of the ship like a massive cat, and the dragon scales shifted colors in the sunlight and moved from deep crimson to bright gold and back again, and his amber eyes were fixed on the alien vessel with an intensity that made Kate nervous, because Ember might look like a simple beast, but he was anything but simple. Arya had explained that dragons were partners and not pets, and they were intelligent beings who had chosen to bond with the elves thousands of years ago, and Ember understood human speech perfectly, even though he rarely chose to communicate directly. And mostly he expressed himself through rumbles and roars and the occasional burst of fire when he was particularly annoyed. The alien ship finished landing, and a ramp extended from its side, and the Zaltharian delegation emerged, and they were impressive in a terrifying sort of way, and the leader stood 7 feet tall, with purple scales covering his. He had 3 eyes arranged in a triangle on his face, and behind him came 20 soldiers, wearing black armor that seemed to absorb light, and they carried weapons that hummed with barely contained energy. The Zaltharian commander walked forward, and his movements were precise and controlled like a predator approaching prey, and he stopped 10 feet from Kate, and his translator device rendered his words into flat, emotionless English, and he said, "I am Commander Zixthril of the Zaltharian Imperial Guard, and we have conquered worlds, while your species was learning to make fire, and this exercise will demonstrate the vast gap between our peoples." Kate stepped forward, and she kept her hand near her sidearm even though she knew it would be useless against their advanced armor, and she said, "Commander Morgan and Navy SEALs, and we are ready when you ROS." Extral 3 eyes focused on Arya, and something flickered across his features, and it might have been confusion, or perhaps the first whisper of doubt, and he asked, "What is this elf doing among warriors?" And his tone suggested he thought it was some kind of joke. Arya moved forward with that same fluid grace, and she stopped beside Kate, and her hand rested on the hilt of one of her twin blades, and those blades were not standard-issue human weapons, and they were forged from some metal that Arya said came from the core of a dead star. And she said, observing, and I do so enjoy watching bullies learn humilitical mandibles click together in what might have been laughter, and he said, the elves are extinct, and the great purge saw to that, and there are no more of your kind left in thee. Galaxy Aria's expression did not change, but her eyes grew colder, and she said clearly, your intelligence is as flawed as your tactics, and some of us survived, and some of us remembered everything Ember chose that moment to uncurl from the mast, and he spread his wings, and they were massive, and blotted out the sun for a moment, and he released a roar that vibrated through the deck plating, and made the Zaltharian soldiers reach for their weapons, and the sound was primal and ancient, and it spoke of a time when dragons ruled the skies of 1,000. Stepped back, and his scales rippled in a pattern that Arya later explained meant uncertainty, and he said, this changes nothing. And we will still proceed with the exercise, and your primitives will still fall before our Might Admiral Lisa Grant emerged from the command tower, and she had been watching the entire exchange on the security cameras, and she was a veteran of 3 wars, and she had seen things that would break lesser people, and she walked up to stand beside Kate and Arya, and she said, the exercise will begin at dawn tomorrow, and the rules are simple, and your forces will hunt, and our forces will survive. And we will see who comes out on top 6. Roll nodded, and his confidence seemed to return, and he said, we will deploy 3 squads of our best shock troops, and they have technology that makes them invisible, and sensors that can track a mouse from orbit, and weapons that can vaporize your ships, and you will have nowhere to hide and nowhere to run. Lisa smiled, and it was the smile of someone who knew something others did not, and she said, we will see, and dismissed, and the meeting is over. The Zeltharians returned to their ship, and Kate turned to Arya and asked if they had a chance, and the elf watched the alien vessel lift off and head to orbit, and she said, humanity always has a chance because you are unpredictable and chaotic, and you never do what others expect, and that is both your greatest weakness and your greatest strength. Kate wanted to feel encouraged, but she had seen the Zaltharian weapons and armor, and she knew what they were capable of, and the intelligence reports painted a grim picture, and every species that had faced the Empire in combat had lost, and most had been completely destroyed. Seemed to sense her doubt, and she placed a hand on Kate's shoulder, and she said, I have spent 6 months with your SEAL teams, and I have taught them techniques that my people developed over millennia, and techniques for moving through terrain without being detected, and methods for striking from unexpected angles, and ways to turn an environment into a weapon, and your people learned faster than I expected, and they adapted the techniques to fit their own style, and they created something new. Glided down and landed on the deck with surprising gentleness for something his size, and he folded his wings and moved close to Arya. And the two shared a look that spoke of deep connection and understanding. Kate asked what the dragon thought, and Arya listened for a moment, even though Ember made no sound, and then she said, Ember thinks the Zeltharians have forgotten what it means to face a truly dangerous opponent, and they have conquered so many weak civilizations that they expect every fight to be easy, and they have grown lazy and overconfident. Lisa joined them, and she said, the teams are ready, and they have been training in the designated zone for weeks, and they know every tree and rock and stream, and they have set up positions that the Zaltharian sensors should not be able to detect, an emphasis on Shadaria. Nodded, and she said, the elven techniques. I taught them work by harmonizing with the environment rather than hiding from it, and most technological sensors look for anomalies and disruptions and disturbances in the natural pattern, but if you become part of the pattern, you become invisible, not because you cannot be seen, but because you register as something natural and unthreatening. Kate tried to wrap her mind around the concept, and it sounded almost mystical, but she had seen Arya demonstrate the technique and watched as the elf literally disappeared into a forest, and not through camouflage or stealth technology, but by somehow becoming part of the woods themselves. And when Kate tried to find her, with thermal sensors and motion detectors and even trained dogs, nothing worked, because Arya registered as just another tree or bush or shadow. The sun was setting now and painting the sky in shades of orange and red and purple, and Kate thought about the teams preparing in the forest and thought about the two Zaltharian shock troops orbiting overhead and confident in their superiority. And she thought about Arya and Ember and the weight of history they carried, and she wondered if humanity was ready for what was coming. Lisa seemed to read her thoughts, and she said, "Ready. You're not, here they come, and we will show them what humans can do when." Sergeant Rachel Stone moved through the forest like water flowing around rocks, and she made no sound as she placed each foot carefully on the mossy ground, and behind her came 5 more members of her team, and they moved with the same fluid grace that Arya had taught them over months of intensive training. The pre-dawn darkness was thick and heavy, and normal humans would have been blind, but Rachel and her team had trained for this, and they had learned to use their other senses and to feel the forest around them rather than just see it. And Arya called it becoming one with the environment, and at first Rachel thought it was mystical nonsense, but then she experienced it herself and understood that it was something far more practical. Rachel earpiece crackled softly, and Kate's voice came through, and she said, "Stone Team the first. Zaltharian squad is moving into your sector, and they are using full sensor sweeps, and their confidence level is extremely higher." Rachel smiled in the darkness, and she whispered back into her "Come," and said, "Copy that, Commander, and let them come, and we are ready." What the Zaltharians did not know was that the SEAL teams had spent the last week preparing this forest in ways that went far beyond
simple camouflage
and traps, and Arya had shown them techniques that her people had used when they fought wars that lasted centuries, and techniques for manipulating an environment so completely that it became a living weapon. The Zaltharian First Squad moved in a standard search formation, and their leader was Kixmore, and he was a veteran of 50 campaigns, and he had never lost a single engagement, and his armor displayed his rank and achievements in glowing symbols, and his weapon was a plasma rifle that could cut through steel like paper. Kixmore checked his sensors, and they showed the terrain in perfect detail, and every tree and rock and stream appeared on his display, and his system could detect heat signatures and motion and even the smallest disturbances in the air, and according to his readouts, there was nothing alive in this sector except small animals and insects. Spoke to his squad through their neural link and said the humans are cowards and they are hiding somewhere else, and we will find them cowering in whatever hole they have dug. His second in command, Tixel, responded and said perhaps they fled entirely and they realized they could not win against us. The squad laughed, and the sound was harsh and grating through their translators, and they moved forward with even less caution than before. Above them, in the trees, Ember watched, and he had compressed himself into a form barely larger than a large dog, and his scales had shifted to match the bark and leaves around him, and he was completely invisible to the Zaltharian sensors because dragons were not bound by the same rules as other creatures, and they could manipulate their own energy signatures in ways that technology could not compensate for. Arya crouched on a branch 15 feet above the alien squad, and she had been there for 3 hours, without moving and without making a sound, and her breathing was so controlled that it registered as nothing more than a gentle breeze, and her body temperature had adjusted to match the surrounding air, and the Zaltharian sensors saw her as part of the tree itself. Rachel team was even closer, and they were positioned around the squad in a loose circle, and they had buried themselves in the forest floor, using techniques that Arya had taught them, and they were covered in moss and leaves and mud, and they had slowed their heartbeats and controlled their breathing, and they had become part of the earth itself. Kixmore stopped suddenly, and his mandibles clicked in confusion, and he said something is wrong, and checked the sensors. Ag and Tixel ran a diagnostic, and everything came back green, and he said all systems are functioning perfectly, and there is nothing here except Oozbutt. Kixmore had survived 50 campaigns by trusting his instincts, and something was making his scales itch with unease, and he said prepare for contact and weapons ready. Though squad formed a defensive circle, and their plasma rifles hummed to life, and they scanned the forest with their own eyes, since their sensors were apparently useless, and for a long moment nothing happened, and the forest was silent except for the wind in the trees and the distant call of birds. Then Ember struck, and he dropped from above like a meteor, and his roar was controlled and focused and aimed directly at the Zaltharian squad, and the sound was not just noise, but a weapon that had been perfected over millions of years, and it bypassed their armor and struck directly at their nervous systems, and half the squad collapsed immediately, and their weapons. Falling from nerveless fingers, Aria moved in the same instant, and she descended from her perch with her twin blades already drawn, and she moved through the remaining standing Zaltharians like a dancer, and her movements were too fast for their eyes to follow, and her blades cut through their armor with impossible ease, and within seconds, the entire squad was on the ground and disarmed. And disabled, but not dead, because Kate had made. Arya promised to minimize casualties. Skixmore lay on his back and stared up at the elf standing over him, and his 3 eyes were wide with shock, and he gasped, "The elves are extinct, and the great purge destroyed them." Alaria knelt beside him, and her voice was cold as starlight, and she said clearly, "Your Empire education system needs improvement, and some of us survived, and some of us remember everything your people tried to make us forget." Trachel and her team emerged from their hiding places, and they appeared literally from the ground itself, and rose like ghosts from the forest floor, and the Zaltharian soldiers, who were still conscious, recoiled in fear. Because they had been lying right next to humans the entire time, and their sensors had not detected anything, Rachel checked her and said, "Commander, this is Stone Team, and first. Zaltharian squad is neutralized and 0 casualties on both sides, and moving to secondary position." Kate voice came back and said, "Excellent work, Stone. Team and the other 2 squads are still searching, and they have not realized what happened yet." The second Zaltharian squad was led by Mixcore, and she was considered one of the Empire's finest tactical minds, and she had conquered 12 worlds personally, and she prided herself on never underestimating an opponent. When Kixmore's squad stopped reporting, Mixcore immediately ordered her squad to halt, and she said, "Something has happened, and Kixmore is too experienced to simply lose contact." Her second asked if they should investigate, and Mixcore considered for a moment, and then said no, and that is what they want, and they are trying to draw us into a trap, and we will proceed with caution and maintain full sensor coverage. Her squad moved forward slowly, and weapons ready, and every soldier was on high alert, and they scanned constantly and checked every shadow and every movement. Lieutenant Sophie Clark led the team assigned to this sector, and she had learned different techniques from Arya than Rachel team had, and where Rachel had learned to hide by becoming part of the earth, Sophie had learned to hide by becoming part of the movement and the flow and the rhythm of the forest itself. Sophie team did not bury themselves or climb trees, and instead they walked openly through the forest, but they moved in patterns that matched the swaying of branches and the rustling of leaves and the flow of wind through the trees, and the Zaltharian sensors detected them but classified them as natural phenomena and non-threatening. Mixcore squad moved through a narrow ravine, and it was the perfect ambush site, and Mixcore knew it, and she ordered her troops to high alert and said, "Watch for traps and watch for hidden positions." But there were no traps and no hidden positions, because Sophie team was already among them, and they had been walking parallel to the Zaltharian squad for 10 minutes, and the aliens had detected them dozens of times, but dismissed them as wind patterns and animal movement. Sophie gave the signal, and her team struck simultaneously, and they moved from harmless environmental noise to lethal combatants in an instant, and they used weapons that Arya had designed specifically for this operation, and weapons that disrupted the Zaltharian armor energy fields without killing the soldiers inside them. The fight was over in 30 seconds, and Mixcore found herself on her knees with a human rifle pointed at her head and Sophie standing over her, and she said, "You fought well, but you fought predictably, and you expected us to hide from your sensors, and you never considered that we might hide by being detected." Mixcore was stunned into silence, and she could not comprehend what had just happened, and her entire squad had been neutralized without her even understanding how. The third Zaltharian squad was led by Zixcore, and he was young and ambitious, and he desperately wanted to prove himself, and when he lost contact with both other squads would haunt him, he ordered his squad to activate their emergency protocols, and they powered up weapons to maximum and engaged. It was full combat mode, and they abandoned all pretense of a training exercise and prepared to kill anything that moved. Commander Zixcore watched from orbit, and he saw what his young squad leader was doing, and he tried to countermand the order, but Communications were being jammed by something, and he could not get through. Kate saw it too, and she turned to Lisa and said, "They have gone lethal, and our people are in danger." Arya was already moving, and Ember launched himself from the command ship deck, and they headed toward the third squad position at speeds that should have been. A possible Lieutenant Amy Walsh led the team in that sector, and she was the youngest of the SEAL commanders, but Commander Zixthril stood before his defeated troops, and the weight of failure pressed down on him like a physical force, and his three eyes moved from the bound soldiers to the humans, standing victorious, and then to the elf and dragon who had shattered his understanding of the galaxy. Kate watched the alien commander struggle with his pride, and she had seen this moment before in different contexts, and she knew it could go two ways, and either he would accept defeat with grace, or he would escalate, and neither option was ideal, but one was far more dangerous than the other. Captain Nicole Hayes stood beside Kate, and she held a tactical display showing the complete breakdown of the engagement, and the data was damning, and it showed that even without Arya and Ember, the human teams had been winning, and the Zaltharians had been outmaneuvered and outhawed at every turn. Nicole spoke, and her voice carried clearly across the clearing, and she said, "Our combat analysis shows that Arya and Ember engaged only your first squad directly, and the other two squads were defeated by purely human forces using techniques we learned and adapted." She turned the display so Zixtro could see and showed him the timeline and the positions and the tactical decisions, and said, "Your second squad walked past our soldiers 17 times, and your sensors detected them but classified them as non-threats, because we learned to move in harmony with the environment, and your third squad was neutralized only after they violated the exercise rules and attempted lethal force." C6 mandibles clicked rapidly. It was a sign of deep agitation, and he said, "This proves nothing, and in real combat the Empire would destroy your world before you could deploy. Your tricks area had been standing quietly, but now she moved forward, and something in her posture made even the human soldiers step back, and her violet eyes seemed to glow with an inner light, and she said, "Would you, and do you, truly believe your empire is the strongest force in this galaxy's?" Exosixtral drew himself up to his full height and said, "The Zaltharian Empire has conquered 17 star systems and absorbed their technology and our fleet numbers in the thousands. And our weapons can crack planets. And yes, we are the strongest area." Smiled, and it was not a kind expression, and she said, "I have watched your empire rise, Commander, and I have seen dozens like it across the millennia, and you conquer worlds that cannot defend themselves, and you absorb their technology, and you call it strength, but you have forgotten what true power looks like." She gestured, and Ember moved forward, and the dragon had been coiled quietly, but now he rose to his full height and spread his wings, and the sunlight streaming through them made patterns of gold and crimson on the ground, and his amber eyes fixed on Zixtral with the weight of ages. Arya continued, and her voice took on a resonance that seemed to echo from the air itself, and she said, "We elves had an empire once, and we spanned galaxies when your ancestors were still crawling in primordial seas. And we had weapons that could unmake stars and ships that could fold space itself, and we thought we were invincible." The clearing had gone silent, and everyone was listening, and even the bound Zaltharian soldiers had stopped struggling, and Zixtral three eyes were weighed. Arya voice dropped lower and became almost gentle, and she said, "And do you know what we learned, Commander? And we learned that there is always something older, and always something stronger, and always something waiting in the dark places between stars, ready to humble the arrogant." She moved closer to Zixtral and said, "Our empire fell because we forgot that lesson, and we grew too proud and too confident and too certain of our own superiority, and then something came, and something we could not fight, and something we could not understand, and in the span of what you would call a generation, our 12 galaxies were reduced to scattered refugees hiding in the shadow Shixtral." The voice was barely a whisper, and he said, "What destroyed you?" Arya shook her head and said, "We never knew, and our records from that time are fragmentary and corrupted by something that wanted our history erased, and all we know is that we drew attention by spreading too far and conquering too completely, and we announced our presence to things that preferred we remain ignorant and contained." She turned to look at the sky and said, "And now you come here with your threats, in your assessments, in your determination to judge whether Earth should be recruited or eliminated, and you have no idea how dangerous that arrogance is. Admiral Lisa Grant chose that moment to step forward, and she had been coordinating with the other branches of military leadership, and she said, "Commander Zixthril, your empire sent you here to test us, and we have given you your test, and now let me make Earth position." Claire stood tall, and her voice carried authority earned through decades of service, and she said, "We are not interested in joining your empire, and we are not going to be eliminated by it, and we are not looking for conflict, but we are also not looking for masters." Lisa gestured at the SEAL team standing around the clearing and said, "Humanity has survived ice ages and plagues and world wars, and we have clawed our way up from caves to space, and we did it without anyone help, and we will continue to do it our way." She nodded toward Arya and Ember and said, "And we have found allies that your empire did not know existed, and allies who have wisdom earned through the rise and fall of civilizations, and allies who see potential in humanity worth nurturing." Lisa's voice hardened, and she said, "So take your assessment back to your superiors and tell them that Earth has friends, and tell them that humanity learns fast and adapts faster, and tell them that if they come in peace, they will be welcomed with open arms." She paused and let the silence stretch, and then said, "But if they come with conquest in mind, then they will find out exactly why humans have a saying about cornered animals being the most dangerous." Ember chose that moment to demonstrate, and he raised his head and released a roar that shook the trees and sent birds exploding into the sky from half a mile away, and the sound was primal and ancient, and spoke of power that predated civilization itself. The ground trembled, and several of the Zaltharian soldiers made sounds of fear, and Zixthril himself took an involuntary step backward. Kate watched the alien commander and saw the moment when understanding finally penetrated his arrogance, and his three eyes moved from Ember to Arya to the human forces and back again, and she could see him recalculating everything he thought he knew. Zixthril finally spoke, and his voice had lost its earlier confidence, and he said, "I will deliver your message, and the Empire will make its decision." Arya moved close to him again and said, "Let me give you one more piece of information to take back, Commander, and it is free advice from someone who has lived long enough to see patterns repeat." She waited until his three eyes focused on her and said, "There are forces in this galaxy far older and far more powerful than the Zaltharian Empire, the ancient elves, or even humanity, and forces that watch and judge and sometimes act." Zixthril asked, "What kind of forces?" Arya expression became distant and sad, and she said, "The kind that rewrite civilizations when they decide those civilizations have grown too dangerous or too disruptive, and the kind that can edit entire cultures and histories and make empires forget they ever wanted to conquer." She let that sink in, and then said, "The elves survived by becoming small and forgotten, and by hiding in the shadows, and by never drawing attention, and we have lived this way for centuries, and only now, with humanity, do we see a species that might be wise enough to grow strong without becoming a threat to the cosmic order." Zixthril was silent for a long moment, and then he said, "You expect me to believe in some mythical force that polices the galaxy?" Arya shrugged and said, "Believe what you want, Commander, but ask yourself this, and why did an empire that spanned 12 galaxies and commanded technology you cannot imagine suddenly vanish from all records? And why do no other ancient species exist anymore? And why is the Zaltharian Empire the oldest surviving civilization you know of at only 5,000 years?" She smiled coldly and said, "Perhaps it is. Because anything older than that gets noticed and gets judged and gets edited or eliminated." The implication hung in the air like smoke, and Kate saw several of the human officers exchanging uneasy glances, because if Arya was telling the truth, then the entire galaxy was far more dangerous than anyone had imagined. Cole spoke up and said, "Regardless of ancient cosmic forces, the immediate situation is clear, and the Zaltharian Empire tested Earth forces, and Earth forces won, and now we all need to decide what comes next." Nodded and said, "Commander Zixthril, we are releasing your soldiers and returning their weapons in powered down mode, and you are free to return to your ship and report to your superiors, and we hope that your report emphasizes cooperation over confrontation. She gestured, and the SEAL teams began cutting the bonds on. The Zaltharian soldiers, and returning their equipment, and the aliens, stood slowly, and they looked confused and ashamed and defeated. Edrical watched this and said, "You are letting us go," and just like that, Kate stepped forward and said, "We are not. Your enemy, Commander, and we defeated you to prove a point, not to start a war, and the point is that Earth is not helpless, and Earth is not alone, and Earth is not interested in being conquered." She met his three-eyed gaze steadily and said, "But we are interested in peaceful relations and trade and cultural exchange and all the things that civilized species should want, and if your empire can approach us as..." 3 days passed after the Zaltharian delegation departed, and Earth military forces remained on high alert, but nothing happened, and the alien ships jumped to faster than light travel and disappeared into the depths of space and communication. Intercepts suggested they were heading back to their home system. Kate stood at the railing of the USS Valiant and watched the sun set over the Pacific Ocean, and the sky turned from blue to orange to deep purple, and stars began to appear one by one, and she felt someone approach and knew it was Arya. Before the elf spoke, Arya's voice was soft and troubled, and she said, "I cannot stop thinking about what comes next and what we may have started." Kate turned to look at her and said, "You think the Zaltharians will retaliate?" Arya shook her head and said, "No, and I think they will do exactly what we asked and report back to their superiors and recommend caution, and the Zaltharian Empire may even become a valuable trading partner in time." She paused, and her violet eyes reflected the last rays of sunlight, and she said, "But that is not what worries me." Kate waited and let the silence stretch, because she had learned that Arya would speak when ready, and pushing would only make her retreat into herself. Finally, Arya continued, and she said, "When, Commander Zixtral saw me, he recognized what I was, and not personally, but he knew about elves, and he knew the old stories about our empire, and that knowledge will spread." Gripped the railing, and her knuckles turned white, and said, "And there are things in this galaxy that pay attention. When old names are spoken again, and things that thought my people were extinct, and things that preferred we stay," that Waka felt her stomach tighten. And she asked what kind of things. Arya opened her mouth to answer, but was interrupted by Lieutenant Amy Walsh running up, and her face was pale, and she said, "Commander, we are picking up something on long-range sensors and multiple contacts and moving faster than anything we have ever tracked." Kate immediately activated her comm and said, "This is Commander Morgan, and all hands to battle stations and get me Merle Grant." And she turned to Amy and asked, "Where are they heading?" Amy's voice shook slightly, and she said, "That is the strange part, Ma, and they are not heading for Earth, and they are intercepting the Zaltharian fleet." The command center erupted into controlled chaos as every screen lit up with data, and Admiral Lisa Grant arrived within 2 minutes, and her hair was still wet from a shower, but her eyes were sharp and focused. Demanded a full report, and Captain Nicole Hayes pulled up the tactical display and said, "We have detected 7 contacts and possibly more, because the signals keep fragmenting, and they are massive, and each one is at least 10 times the size of the largest Zaltharian vessel." She manipulated the display and showed their trajectory and said they will intercept the Zaltharian fleet in approximately 40 minutes, and the Zaltharians have detected them and are attempting evasive maneuvers. Arya was suddenly there, and nobody had seen her enter the command center, and her face was white and her hands trembled, and she whispered, "No, and oh, but ancient trees, no, and not them," and not yet everyone turned to look at her, and Kate asked, "Who are they, Arya?" The voice was barely audible, and she said, "The archivists, and the ones who ended the Elven Empire, and the ones who decide which civilizations are allowed to continue existing." The room went silent, and even the constant hum of electronics seemed to fade, and Lisa asked very carefully, "What do you mean, decide which civilizations are allowed to exist?" Arya moved to the tactical display, and her hands moved over it with practiced ease, and she pulled up star charts and overlaid historical data, and showed gaps and empty spaces where civilizations should have been. She said, "Throughout galactic history, there have been empires that rose to prominence and conquered widely, and then vanished, and not through war or plague or natural disaster, but through something else. She pointed to the gaps and said the elves were not the only ones, and there were the Kyrathi, who controlled 30 systems, and the Velthem, who had technology that could terraform worlds in days in the Nexari, who achieved post-biological existence. Her voice grew quieter, and she said, and all of them are gone and erased so completely that most species do not even remember. They existed, and all that remains are fragments and ruins and half-remembered. Myths. Nicole asked what happened to them. Maria turned, and her eyes were haunted, and she said, the archivists happened, and they came in ships like the ones heading toward the Zaltharians now, and they studied, and they analyzed, and they judged. She took a shaky breath and said, and if they found a civilization lacking in some way, they edited it, and they changed its culture and its history and its very nature until it no longer posed whatever threat they perceived. Kate struggled to comprehend the implications, and she said, you were talking about mind control on a civilization-wide scale. Arya nodded and said, not just mind control, but reality alteration, and the archivists have technology or abilities that can rewrite memory and alter records and change the fundamental nature of a species. Understanding of itself, she gestured at the display showing the approaching ships and said, when they came for my people, we tried to fight, and we had weapons that could shatter moons and shields that could withstand nova detonations, and it did not matter. Her voice broke slightly and said, they simply studied us, and then they reached into our civilization and twisted it, and within one generation, the Elven Empire had forgotten conquest and forgotten expansion and forgotten everything that made us. A galactic power sheet looked at Kate with desperate intensity and said, and those of us who remembered and who tried to resist found that nobody would believe us, and our own people thought we were insane, and within 2 generations, the Empire had dissolved peacefully, and most elves had returned to their homeworlds and chosen isolation. Isa asked how you escaped. Arya smiled bitterly, and she said, I did not escape, and I was edited like everyone else, and I forgot who I was and what my people had been. And when I said people had been a simple, quiet life on a colony world, she touched her temple and said, but something went wrong with my editing, and maybe I was too old or too stubborn or just unlucky, and about 50 years ago the memories started coming back, and slowly at first, and then all at once, in the horror of realizing what had been done to me and to my entire species was almost unbearable. Kate watched the tactical display, where the unknown ships were closing on the Zaltharian fleet, and she asked, can we help them, and can we warn? Maria shook her head violently and said, no, and if we intervene, we will only draw the archivist's attention to Earth, and that is the last thing we want. She moved closer to the display, and her hands were shaking, and she said, we must watch, and we must learn, and we must pray that the archivists still follow there. Old Patterns Lieutenant Sophie Clark asked, what patterns are Rhea? Said, the archivists do not destroy, and they preserve. And they study, and they only edit civilizations that they deem to have grown beyond their wisdom. She pointed at the Zaltharian fleet, and said, the Zaltharian Empire has conquered 17 systems, and they came to Earth with threats, and they demonstrated exactly the kind of arrogance that attracts archivist attention. Aunt's attention, Lisa, understood immediately, and she said so by humiliating. The Zaltharians, we may have triggered this area, nodded slowly and said, possibly, and the archivists may have been watching the Zaltharians already. Our demonstration may have simply confirmed what they suspected, and that the Empire had become dangerous. The tactical display updated and showed that the archivist ships had reached the Zaltharian fleet, and Kate expected to see weapons, fire, and explosions, and the chaos of battle instead. Zaltharian ships simply stopped moving, and they hung motionless in space like insects trapped in amber, and their communications went dead, and their engines went dark, and they became lifeless holes floating in the void. Nicole voice was tight with tension, and she said, all Zaltharian vessels have gone dark, and no weapons fire detected, and no energy signatures, except from the unknown ships. The archivist vessels circled the Zaltharian fleet like sharks around prey, and lights played across the hulls of the disabled ships in colors that hurt to look at, and patterns that seemed to shift and change even as you watched. Taria whispered. They are scanning and analyzing and cataloging everything about the Zeltharians and their culture and their technology and their history and their very essence. The process took 17 minutes by the command center chronometer, and nobody spoke during that time, and everyone watched the display with horrified fascination. Then the lights stopped, and the archivist ship simply accelerated away, and they moved at speeds that should have been impossible, and within 6 minutes they had disappeared from even the most sensitive sensors. For a long moment, nobody moved, and then Amy checked her console and said the Zeltharian ships are powering back up, and life support is active, and communications are being restored. Lisa ordered communications to open a channel to the Zeltharian fleet, and after several attempts, Commander Zixthril voice came through, and it sounded confused and uncertain. Zixthril said, "This is the Zeltharian exploration vessel Unity, and we seem to have experienced some kind of system malfunction and requesting assistance with navigation." Nicole turned to Lisa with wide eyes and said, "Exploration vessel and their entire fleet designation has changed, and they are identifying as explorers, not as an imperial military force." 6 months had passed since the archivists appeared and changed everything, and Earth had transformed in ways both visible and subtle, and the revelation that powerful beings monitored galactic civilizations had fundamentally altered humanity's approach to space exploration. And military development commander Kate Morgan stood in what had been designated as the Sanctuary, and it was a facility built deep in the Colorado mountains. And it was here that something remarkable was happening, and something that gave her hope for the first time since watching the Zeltharian fleet get edited. Arya stood beside her, and the elf looked more peaceful than Kate had ever seen her, and she was smiling as she watched the main chamber where 36 figures moved and talked and worked together. Kate said, "I still cannot believe they came, and that you found them, and that they were willing to reveal themselves." Arya nodded, and her silver hair caught the light from the overhead panels, and she said, "I sent messages to every contact I had maintained over the centuries, and to survivors I knew were hiding on 17 different worlds, and I was honest about the risks, and I told them everything that had happened with the Zeltharians and the archivists." An Earth responser gestured at the chamber and said, "And they came because humanity pressed them, and because you showed wisdom that my people took millennia to develop, and because they are tired of hiding and tired of being alone." Kate watched as an elf with green hair and golden eyes worked with Lieutenant Sophie Clark on some kind of holographic interface, and another elf with dark skin and white hair sat in deep conversation with Captain Nicole Hayes. And everywhere she saw humans and elves working together as if it was the most natural thing in the world. Admiral Lisa Grant entered the chamber, and she had just returned from a meeting with the Joint Chiefs and the President, and she looked tired but satisfied, and she said, "It is official, and the Elven Remnant is formally recognized as allied citizens with full rights and protections, and they can live and work anywhere on Earth or in Earth-controlled space." Arya closed her eyes briefly, and when she opened them, Kate saw tears, and she said, "Thank you, and you have given my people something we have not had in centuries, and a home." Lisa smiled and said, "You have earned it, and you saved lives during the Zeltharian incident, and you have shared technology and knowledge that will advance humanity by decades, and you have taught us that strength without wisdom is worthless." She looked around the chamber and said, "And more importantly, you have given us perspective, and you have shown us what happens when a civilization grows too fast and conquers too widely, and your story has become required learning for every officer and diplomat and scientist who works in space." Kate asked what the response has been from other nations. Lisa said mixed, but mostly positive, and everyone understands that we need allies, and that the galaxy is far more dangerous than we thought, and most governments are establishing their own exchange programs and cultural centers and research partnerships with the Elven survivors who are willing to participate. Taria said, "There are approximately 3,000 of us left scattered across 17 worlds, and not all will come forward, and some prefer to remain hidden, and some are too damaged by what was done to us to trust any species again." She looked sad for a moment and said, "But perhaps 500 will join Earth and will become part of this new alliance, and that is 500 living repositories of ancient knowledge, and 5 100 perspectives spanning centuries and 500 voices saying that humanity deserves to survive and thrive. Lieutenant Amy Walsh approached, and she carried a tablet, and she said, "Commander Morgan, the first joint research facility is ready, and the one focused on defensive technology, and Arya has agreed to help us understand some of the systems her people developed." Kate followed Amy to a secure wing of the sanctuary, and inside was a large laboratory filled with equipment, both human and elven, in origin. And Ember was there, and the dragon had grown noticeably larger over the past months, and he was examining a holographic display with what appeared to be intense interest. Arya moved to stand beside her partner, and she ran a hand along his scaled neck, and she said, "Ember has always been fascinated by technology, and dragons are not just warriors or beasts, and they are philosophers and scientists and historians, and in the old days they were our partners in discovery as much as in battle." Kate watched as Ember manipulated the holographic display, the precise movements of his claws, and the dragon was examining what looked like spacecraft schematics and making adjustments and improvements that the human engineers immediately began discussing. Excitedly, an elf named Kira approached, and she had violet skin and silver eyes, and she had been introduced as one of the foremost experts on energy systems that survived the fall. And she said, "We are working on shield technology that will protect Earth vessels without requiring aggressive postures and shields that absorb and dissipate rather than reflect or counter sheath." Pulled up a demonstration and showed how the shields worked, and said, "This is based on principles the elves developed late in our empire, and after we had started to understand that aggression only bred more aggression, and these shields make a ship difficult to target without making it appear threatening." Nickel studied the display, and she said, "This is remarkable, and our current shields either work or they do not, and but these seem to adapt and flow and almost think." Kira smiled and said, "Exactly. And they harmonize with their environment rather than fighting against it, and much like the techniques Arya taught your soldiers for moving through the forest unseen." Over the following weeks, Kate watched as the sanctuary
Out.
something far more significant, and it became a true cultural exchange center where humans learned from elves, and elves remembered what it was like to have purpose beyond simple survival. Rachel Stone Kate spent her days training with elven combat masters and learning techniques that dated back thousands of years, and she in turn taught them modern tactics and human psychological approaches to warfare. And the exchange created something entirely new in fighting styles that combined ancient wisdom with contemporary innovation. Sophie Clark worked with elven scientists on propulsion systems and communication, technology, and biological sciences, and every breakthrough was shared immediately with the broader scientific community in Earth. Technology was advancing at an unprecedented rate, but always with an eye toward defense and exploration. Rather than conquest, one evening, Kate found Arya on the observation deck, and the elf was watching the sunset paint the mountains in gold and red, and she looked contemplative. Kate joined her and said, "You seem worried." Arya nodded slowly and said, I'm thinking about the Zaltharians and about what happened to them, and I sent observers to check on their progress." 8 asked, "What did you find?" Daria turned to face her and said, "The transformation is complete, and the Zaltharian Empire no longer exists. And it has become the Zaltharian Coalition, an loose association of worlds focused on scientific exploration and cultural exchange. And they have no memory of ever being conquerors." She looked back at the mountains and said, "I spoke with Commander Zixthril, and he is now Exploration Coordinator Zixthril, and he was friendly and curious and eager to establish peaceful relations with Earth, and he had no idea who I was or that we had met before under very different circumstances." Chill, and she said, "That must have been disturbing." Arya smiled sadly, said it was a reminder of what could have happened to Earth, and of what might still happen if humanity loses its way, and the archivists are still out there, and still watching. And still judging, she placed a hand on Kate's shoulder and said, "But it is also a reminder of why this alliance matters, and why what we are building here is so important, and humanity has a chance to grow strong while remaining wise, and that is vanishingly rare in galactic history." Kate asked if she thought Earth would succeed. Arya was quiet for a long moment, and she watched the sun disappear behind the mountains, and finally she said, "I think humanity has something my people lost, and you have diversity of thought and culture and approach, and the Elven Empire was unified and single-minded. And certain of its superiorities, she gestured back toward the sanctuary and said, "But humanity is chaotic and argumentative and full of competing ideas, and that makes you flexible, and that makes you adaptable, and that makes you capable of learning and changing in ways." And everywhere Kate smiled and said, "You are saying our dysfunction is actually a strength." Aria laughed, and it was a sound that Kate had rarely heard from the ancient elf, and she said, "Exactly. And you cannot become too rigid if you are constantly arguing with yourselves, and you cannot become too certain if you are always questioning, and you cannot become too arrogant if half. Your species is always ready to point out your flaws." She grew serious again and said, "And that is what will save you. That is what will let you survive and thrive, while others fall, and you have built-in humility because you are never united. Enough to think you have all the answers." The months that followed saw the establishment of joint research centers on 6 continents, and the creation of mixed exploration teams that ventured into near-Earth space, and the development of defensive systems that borrowed from both human and elven engineering. The Zaltharian Coalition reached out and established diplomatic relations, and they were true to their edited